The Subcommittee on Intelligence and Counterterrorism will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank our witnesses from the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State for being here today to discuss a complex and pressing topic that deals directly with our safety here at home. As the president said just last night, we won't ignore what our intelligence agencies have determined to be the most lethal terrorist threat to our homeland today: white supremacy. With that in mind, our subcommittee is meeting today to explore the threats posed by transnational, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, or RIMVs. That's an acronym because the government just loves our acronyms. Our focus today is on the connections between individuals and groups here in the US who use violence to further their racially or ethnically driven political goals, and the growing number of foreign groups who share their aims, ideologies, and violent designs. While the information our intelligence community has on some of these foreign groups is admittedly less than we'd like, the intelligence community has assessed that domestic, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist groups which advocate for the superiority of the white race have, quote, the most persistent and concerning transnational connections of all US domestic violent extremists. Through these connections, they spread propaganda, train, and attempt to collaborate in carrying out violent acts. Given their relative ease of travel and communication, labeling these groups, their leaders, and their supporters as what they are is all the more important to curb the threat at home and abroad. That said, it remains true that foreign groups with transnational ties span a broad range of ideologies, including everyone from white supremacists and to radical Islamic terrorists. This isn't a new or unfamiliar threat. It's one we've been confronted in various forms for decades. But over the past few years, the US and countries around the world have seen a surge in violence and terrorism perpetrated by these kinds of organizations. This isn't just an American threat, it's a global one. Many of these foreign groups are downright eager to use deadly violence to advance their goals. They are often heavily armed, such as the Nordic resistance movement. They are trained in firearms and communication security tactics. They are often coordinated, and they are increasingly global. Another example. Secretary Pompeo, after recruiting and training followers for urban assaults, like the one its trainees carried out in Gothenburg, Sweden. Combat 18, which started in the UK, has similarly organized around neo-Nazi principles, and as recently as 2019 was linked to the assassination of a German politician. In recent years, we've seen individual Americans reaching out to foreign groups and connecting over common ideology, tactics, and training. A handful of Americans have even sought to travel overseas to take up arms and fight alongside these groups. We saw it, for instance, in September 2019, when a US Army soldier at Fort Riley, who was planning to travel to Ukraine to fight with the Azov Battalion, a paramilitary militia, was arrested for distributing bomb-making instructions. We have seen this for 20 years as individual Americans get radicalized online, seek out groups like Al-Qaeda in Yemen, and share tactics, ideology, and in some cases, carry out deadly attacks in the United States. Just as we in the government have spent significant effort to root out all these individual Americans, so too should we care about American white supremacists sharing tactics and training across national lines. To that end, given the threat of violence from white supremacist extremists, we need to look at their links to foreign organizations, especially as the barriers to communicate, plan, recruit, and train internationally with their ideological sympathizers has nearly disappeared. My colleagues here this morning were also with me on January 6th as we experienced a firsthand manifestation of the threat we are going to talk about today. We all saw the havoc domestic terrorists and other rioters caused as they tried to upend our democratic process, and we mourn the loss of life that resulted. As the dust settles from the attack and hundreds of the insurrectionists have been charged with an assortment of crimes, we are beginning to see the connections between some of the more organized groups connected to that attack and sympathetic groups that have taken root in parts of Europe, Australia, and elsewhere. For example, the Proud Boys, which has had a number of its members indicted on conspiracy charges around January 6th, has spawned local chapters not just in the US, but in Britain, Norway, and Australia. Canada is so concerned about the Proud Boys that they have made the decision to list them as a foreign terrorist organization, along with the base and the Atomwaffen division. This is something we will need to discuss here today. I spent a significant amount of my time examining the connections between terrorists and their networks in the Middle East in my prior life before running for Congress. And I have been surprised by the vast amount of publicly available information that demonstrates the international connections of some of these US-based extremist groups, especially ones promoting a white supremacist ideology. We can see for ourselves that these domestic groups are generating, and in many cases exporting, a unique brand of terrorism. And they're learning lessons from plots, propaganda, and attacks that are similarly driven by hate and violence abroad. The State Department's move last year to designate the Russian imperial movement as one of these SDGTs, or specifically designated global terrorists, was an unprecedented and important first step to begin addressing this threat, but it didn't go nearly far enough, and the time is now to take further action. Earlier this month, I sent a letter to Secretary of State Tony Blinken, asking him to use publicly available evidence, along with intelligence our government has, to determine whether certain foreign white supremacist groups should be labeled as foreign terrorist organizations under the Department of State's formal process and criteria. If they couldn't go as far as listing them as an FTO, I asked that they consider labeling them an SDGT, a specially designated global terrorist group. If designated as an FTO, the US can limit a foreign group's financial, property, and travel interests. An SDGT designation allows for the blocking of the group's assets, as well as those associated individuals or subgroups, but this designation does not restrict travel to the United States, though it flags those individuals in numerous watch lists. In the department's response to me, which we just received last week, which I deeply appreciate, the State Department emphasized that a lack of updated, credible information and intelligence about these foreign groups is one of the, quote, important limitations they face when considering groups for designation. This is an issue I'll be raising directly with the intelligence community this week. I'd hoped to raise these issues with leadership from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence today. Unfortunately, they were unable to participate in this hearing. Nonetheless, I'm eager to hear from our witnesses about the level and quality of intelligence we've collected on these organizations thus far, and how we can ensure that the State Department has the information and tools it needs to make these designations if they're deemed to meet the appropriate criteria. The challenge of domestic violent extremism is one that we need to confront and take on here at home within our communities, and with careful respect for our domestic laws, civil rights, and civil liberties. But any solution will require an understanding of these transnational ties and trends, as well as coordination with our allies. Additionally, we need to see a much more robust, coordinated effort between government and private sector companies to take on this challenge, particularly the companies that operate social media platforms, which we know are abused to spread racially and ethnically motivated extremist ideology worldwide. For our government, this issue sits at a crossroads of two agencies uniquely charged with keeping us safe at home and encouraging peace, liberty, and prosperity abroad. Their different vantage points will shed light on this topic and help us understand how Congress can effectively confront violent extremist threats that are rapidly taking root in communities large and small across the country. I look forward to hearing how your agencies are engaged in this fight and how we as members of Congress can help. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for holding this hearing, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to our very credible witnesses as well, Mr. Cohen, the Coordinator for Counterterrorism, Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention, and Mr. John Godfrey. I appreciated the opportunity to speak with them beforehand and have some good conversations. And I think their credibility, their professional career will add much to this discussion and really, bring out the facts on what threat we are facing and how we as a country can better deal with that. And as I said in our first official hearing on this subcommittee, it's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that we're doing everything we can to search those facts, to understand the threat landscape, to be a threat-based committee that is not a partisan issue. This is a nonpartisan piece of work for us to protect our homeland, and that's really the most important thing. And whether it's domestic violent extremist or foreign organizations, we need to search that out for intelligence. The intelligence piece of this committee is extremely important for us to understand the facts, to come up with a game plan, and to adequately equip the organizations that sit within our jurisdiction so that they can do their job to continue to protect us. And so I'm glad to find that we're continuing to search out key areas of bipartisanship where we can do so. Racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, along with anti-government or anti-authority violent extremism, and every category of domestic terrorism cannot be tolerated. Not by our law enforcement, not by our prosecutors, not by us in Congress, and not by the American public. And those who commit crimes in furtherance of extremist agendas, no matter what their ideology is, must be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. And that's why we're here today to talk about that. And I think it's important for all of us on this subcommittee and for Congress as a whole to also recognize that our foreign adversaries who are out there every single day, as our national security strategy has stated, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, they're continually attempting and succeeding in some points at dividing the American public through amplification of extremist messaging, through online platforms. Foreign governments are attempting to influence the American people through social media. Whether it's to impact an election or to breed hate amongst our citizens, I believe it is a problem. It's a problem that is not new, but what is new at this point in time is the rapidity and the speed in which these organizations can reach everyday citizens in our country because of those social media platforms. And I hope that we can get into that today to look at that. But on the other side of the problem, we do, as the chair said, and Madam Chair, thank you very much for mentioning the fact that the balance and tension here is really to make sure that the protected rights, the First Amendment rights, remain protected. And I think it's also incumbent for us to look at the fact that, we as a country, I think we can look at this as the sky is falling, or we can also look at it as these are mostly lone wolf actions. And these lone wolf actions are very difficult to identify and to predict and then to do something about. And that's why we're here today, is to talk about those ways of doing it. But as an American society, as a culture, for somebody who has spent my career fighting against all sorts of threats around the globe, I think we should look at our system of justice and the law enforcement agents and those who are studying this on a daily basis and say, there is a bright side to this, that the organization, and from my conversations with our witnesses today, it seems to be a lone wolf type of a threat instead of a very organized threat that we see in some of the foreign terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda and like ISIS and others that have organized to the point where they are affecting society as a whole. And so let's dig into that, and let's not be afraid to look at those facts. It's on points like these that I look forward to working with Chair Slotkin and other members of the subcommittee to address the variety of challenges that we're facing. And the threat landscape today is vast. It's far and wide, whether we're dealing with cyber attacks from China, ISIS, whether it's in Syria, or terrorism, domestic terrorism here on American soil. There's a lot of work to be done, and we need to look forward to working with the executive branch agencies, the partners there that are combating the threat of terrorism both internationally and domestically, day in and day out, and we thank them for that. So I absolutely look forward to the contents of this hearing. I think that it's also important to admit and to look today at what is happening along our border. And it's, as an intelligence and counterterrorism subcommittee, we really need to look at the intelligence that we are putting and the emphasis that we are putting on the surge at our southern border. And let's not be distracted by one word or another. But if we have folks that are on terror list that are getting into this country, then the threat of domestic terrorism will continue to rise in this country, because once they get into this country, they are now domestic. And so let's talk about that. And while the contents of this hearing are going to be focused on a different subject, I do look forward, Madam Chair, to putting that forth to our agencies and those under our jurisdiction to really understand whether it's on the northern border and the racially motivated extremist groups that do threaten us, or whether it's on the southern border and groups that we may not know having access to our country. It's a threat to our homeland. And so I think our witnesses, I think, Madam Chair, your leadership to get to the bottom of this, to have a fact-based conversation, and to truly dig in and protect the American people according to our oath sworn to the Constitution. So with that, I yield back. Thank you for your time.
I thank the ranking member. Members are also reminded that the subcommittee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member of the full committee in their February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. I don't see Chairman Thompson here, so we will proceed, and I don't see Ranking Member Katko. So I'll now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. John Godfrey, the Acting Coordinator for Counterterrorism and Acting Special Envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS of the Department of State. As the acting coordinator, Mr. Godfrey leads the State Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism in developing coordinated strategies and approaches to defeat terrorism abroad and securing the counterterrorism cooperation of international partners. Prior to this role, Acting Coordinator Godfrey served as the Acting Deputy Chief of Mission for Embassy Riyadh. Our second witness is Mr. John Cohen, the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention for the Department of Homeland Security. Assistant Secretary Cohen has over 3 decades of experience in law enforcement, counterintelligence, and homeland security. Assistant Secretary Cohen has returned to DHS after having previously served as the Counterterrorism Coordinator and acting Undersecretary for Intelligence and Analysis. In this capacity, Mr. Cohen led DHS's efforts to counter violent extremism and improve information sharing. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes. There is a little clock on your screen, so you can check yourself. And I'll start with Acting Coordinator Godfrey.
Chairwoman Slotkin, Ranking Member Pfluger, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today. I'm here today to discuss the international dimensions of what we call racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMV, and we do indeed love acronyms, and the State Department's ongoing efforts to address this transnational threat. I would ask that my full written statement be entered into the record. Just last month, we commemorated the 2nd anniversary of the terrible attacks on 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, a horror that was live streamed and amplified by supporters on the internet for all the world to see. This massacre was shocking, but unfortunately it was not unique. Indeed, from Christchurch and Pittsburgh to Quebec City and Hanau, we have seen an escalation in violence perpetrated by REMV actors globally. That is why the Biden-Harris administration has made countering REMV, including white identity terrorism, a top priority. The National Security Council staff is leading a comprehensive review of the domestic terrorist landscape, including REMV, with the goal of formulating a strategic framework to address this threat. Today, I wish to focus on the transnational dimensions of this threat. A brief note on terminology. The State Department uses the term REMV for attacks perpetrated by individuals and groups aiming to advance a political agenda to defend against what they perceive as threats to their racial or ethnic identity. REMV individuals and groups often violently target members of religious, racial, or ethnic minority groups, immigrants, LGBTQI+ persons, and governments. Today's digital platforms connect REMV individuals and groups to a broad range of conspiracy theories, misinformation and disinformation, and violent extremist ideologies, fueling a perverse fear of a so-called white genocide and other exclusionary narratives and stoking calls to action. REMV actors often communicate through mainstream social media platforms, anonymous online messaging boards and gaming platforms, smaller websites with targeted audiences, and end-to-end encrypted chat applications, often using coded language and symbols. Through these avenues, REMV groups across the ideological spectrum fundraise, communicate, recruit, radicalize, and inspire others to violence. They also share practical information about how to establish and run training facilities, procure fraudulent travel documents, and clandestinely move people and materiel. As a result, many REMV attacks are carried out by lone actors who are not affiliated with a single group, but who are instead inspired by transnational connections, often but not only in digital space, with REMV actors abroad. Before I outline the State Department's efforts, let me first say a brief word about the whole of government approach this administration is bringing to this fight. Domestically, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have the lead on protecting the homeland from this threat and investigating cases, including those involving REMV. The State Department's role begins at our borders and extends internationally. We work closely with a range of other interagency partners in this effort as well. The Secretary formally designated the Counterterrorism Coordinator on February 24th, 2021, to coordinate the Department's global efforts to counter white identity terrorism, fulfilling a requirement in the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. To that end, the Department is proactively coordinating with diplomatic posts, interagency stakeholders, academic entities, and other relevant parties to address these threats. The State Department also has a number of tools to counter REMV. First, terrorist designations. In April 2020, as the chairwoman mentioned, we designated the Russian Imperial Movement and 3 of its leaders as specially designated global terrorists, the first time we have designated REMV actors using State Department authorities. Second, preventing terrorist travel by REMV actors. The State Department is actively encouraging partner governments to nominate REMV actors as appropriate into their own national watch lists, as well as international law enforcement platforms such as Interpol's. Third, diplomatic engagement. The State Department proactively engages with foreign partners to bolster information sharing on REMV, and those efforts have recently intensified. Fourth, using public diplomacy tools, we are leveraging international platforms to build the capacity of local governments to address the REMV threat. Fifth, engagement with the tech sector, and this involves first informing providers of what the threat is, and second, urging them to voluntarily establish and then rigorously enforce terms of service to allow them to remove online content that doesn't meet those terms of service. And finally, we use our foreign assistance to build partner capacity around the world. We are committed to protecting the United States and our interests from the increasingly dangerous REMV actors that we face, and we are leading the global community in acknowledging, understanding, and effectively addressing the transnational dimension of this REMV threat. We very much welcome the interest of the Congress in this issue, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your testimony. I now recognize Assistant Secretary Cohen to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Slotkin, Ranking Member Pfluger, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today to discuss this important issue. I too have submitted a written statement for the record, and I ask that it be submitted as part of the record. In preparing for this hearing, it allowed me some time for some self-reflection. As you pointed out, Madam Chairwoman, this is my second tour with DHS. This is the 3rd presidential administration that I've served with since the September 11th attack. And this is part of a 35+ year career in law enforcement and homeland security. And I echo your and the ranking member's comments about the importance of this hearing and the topic we are discussing, because in those 35+ years, I have to say, I believe this is the most dynamic, complex, and volatile threat environment that this nation has confronted since September 11th. And while after September 11th, the United States built a tremendous capability to detect and prevent attacks from persons coming to the US from abroad, persons who had been recruited and trained and deployed by foreign terrorist organizations, many of those capabilities simply do not address important elements of the threat we're facing today. So while the US government remains concerned and very focused on preventing attacks by foreign terrorist organizations, today the most significant terrorism threat facing the US involves acts of targeted violence by lone offenders and small groups, in particular those inspired by domestic extremist beliefs. And while the use of violence is not limited to a single ideological belief system, among DVEs, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, white identity extremists, or white supremacist extremists remain the most persistent and lethal threat facing the homeland. But if we're going to be effective in countering the current threat, we really have to, as Representative Pfluger pointed out, come to this from a fact-based and common understanding of the threat. So what do I mean by that? The threat we face today primarily comes from within the United States, from individuals and small groups who self-connect with an ideological belief system, and they use those ideological beliefs to justify the use of violence as a way to express their dissatisfaction with our nation or with their personal situation. And for many of those who have conducted attacks or have been disrupted from and prevented from conducting attacks, their connection with these ideological beliefs comes through the consumption of racist, violent extremist, terrorism-related materials and conspiracy theories that they find online through social media and other online platforms. Further complicating the threat environment is that our adversaries, whether they be foreign nation states, international extremist thought leaders, or even foreign terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, they understand this. And they have devoted themselves towards understanding and leveraging the fractures in our society so that they can also disseminate extremist rhetoric and other false narratives in an effort to incite violence and sow discord. So over the past several years, the United States has experienced a number of targeted attacks by angry, disaffected individuals motivated by a combination of extremist ideologies and/or personal grievances. And these attacks have targeted a cross-section of our society. People and facilities have been targeted because of their faith, their political beliefs, their race, their gender, or their ethnicity. And this is a threat that is increasingly becoming international. As my colleague, Coordinator Godfrey, pointed out, we are increasingly concerned about the sharing of resources and extremist rhetoric online between those in the United States and those like-minded people abroad. We're also concerned about the use of encrypted communication technologies, the dark web, cryptocurrencies, by individuals who have adopted these extremist ideologies so they can further that coordination and do so in a way that avoids detection of law enforcement. Further complicating and challenging law enforcement and counterterrorism officials as we seek to confront this threat is that we have to understand that the close proximity between constitutionally protected speech and other constitutionally protected activities and the threat of violence posed by individuals who use that speech or leverage that speech as a way to incite violence. And as we address the serious and dangerous nature of the threat posed by domestic violent extremists, we must be mindful and protective of the constitutional rights afforded all Americans. Our job is not to police thought and speech. Our job is to prevent acts of violence. And this has been a major priority for the department since January 20th. We have engaged in a number of activities intended to address this threat, and I'm happy to discuss those further during the questioning portioning of this. So thank you again, Madam Chairwoman. I look forward to your questions.
Great. I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. I will remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. When you hit close to your 5 minutes, you'll hear off stage here my gavel reminding you that you're coming to the end of the time, and of course it's on the screen. I'll now recognize myself for some questions. So Mr. Godfrey, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I sent that letter to Secretary Blinken. I'm sure you had a hand in drafting the response, and I appreciate that. I've never in my life seen a letter sent to a department or agency come back before the deadline that we asked for it. So thank you for that. You know, but the sort of comments that came back in the letter say that, you know, an important limitation on your ability to designate these violent RIMVs is the ability of sufficient credible information that meets standards for designation. Speak to us a little bit about that, because, you know, my experience working in the post 9/11 era is right after 9/11, you know, while there was a handful of people who had been watching a group like Al-Qaeda, there was really a full-throated effort for years to build up the architecture to prevent future terrorist attacks from Al-Qaeda. And we've been incredibly successful, but it was an extreme level of effort to get to the visibility on leaders, tactics, money, organization, communication that we now enjoy for some of these groups. Can you speak more to the information and intelligence gaps that the department has encountered on these foreign RIMVs?
Thank you, Madam Chair, I'm glad we got our homework in on time. That's always good to
It's impressive.
know. Thank you. I'm happy to address your question. It's a really important one, and I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about how the designations work. And so I'm happy to take this opportunity to shed a little light on that. They're definitely a critical tool in our effort to address REMV, as they have been in our efforts against other terrorist threats down through the years. Our counterterrorism authorities at the State Department can only be applied to foreign persons or organizations, or those that are primarily, can't be used to designate individuals or organizations that are predominantly based in the United States or exclusively US based. And there are a couple of challenges that we frequently encounter in the REMV arena. That includes a lack of sufficient information about these groups or actors. And let me just unpack that a little bit. Unlike ISIS or Al-Qaeda, for example, REMV actors have a much more diffuse organizational structure. Most of these so-called organizations don't necessarily have a clear leadership or command and control structure, and that includes one that directs and coordinates attacks, which can be a critical element in assessing whether the activities of an individual or a group can be attributed to an organization for designation purposes. In order to designate a group, we have to be able to demonstrate that it's engaged in terrorist activity, and that's defined as having a capacity and an intent to carry out terrorist activity. And unlike some of our foreign partners who have recently designated REMV organizations, we are unable to designate groups based solely on hateful speech without providing an additional link to actual terrorist activity. So the other thing I would flag, and this is something that's already been touched on by a number of individuals already, is that many of these groups have become quite sophisticated in their use of end-to-end encrypted communications, which poses challenges with respect to gathering information about their organizational structures and activities. I think that in your discussions coming up with the intelligence community, I don't in any way want to speak for them, but I would anticipate that you will hear quite a lot about that, that the increased prevalence of commercially available encrypted technology does constitute a real challenge in this space. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'll be following up, sending some letters to the intelligence community, asking them to put a higher priority on some of these foreign REMVs so that we can close some of those gaps. You raised a good point that I want to turn to Mr. Cohen. As a Michigander, someone who enjoys in normal non-COVID times constantly going back and forth over the Canadian border or over the US-Canadian border, what does it mean that Canada has taken the step to designate the Proud Boys and the base as foreign terrorist organizations? What specifically can our poor border agents in Windsor and Detroit expect is the new requirement or any changes to what we do on the American side, given that our closest English-speaking cousin has designated these groups?
I'm sure the question. As you are aware, our Customs and Border Protection personnel work very closely with Canada, as well as other close allies such as the UK, New Zealand, and Australia. We have extensive information sharing relationships with them. As it relates specifically to your question, if someone is driving from Detroit over the bridge to Windsor, it's not the Customs and Border Patrol officer that would have the first encounter with them. Their first encounter would be with Canadian authorities. And if the Canadian authorities had some reason to believe that that individual seeking entry to the country was a member of a group that had been designated as a terrorist organization under their laws, then they could be denied entry. They could be subject to more extensive scrutiny. If that were to occur, that information would be relayed back to U.S. authorities, and potentially there could be further action.
I've already abused the clock. I apologize for setting a bad example, but I will come back to you on what we are now or not putting into our databases to flag for the Canadians, if there's been any changes as it relates to someone being a Proud Boy or a member of the base. I recognize Mr. Pfluger for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And 5 minutes goes very quickly in this discussion. I appreciate both witnesses' statements. I've got a couple of questions that I'll get to, but let me just ask very quickly. This is the fringes of our society. I mean, if you were to put a percentage point by it, 0.00001% of our society who is in the business of thinking about racially motivated violence, which is inexcusable and has no place in this society. Is that true? I mean, these are the fringes, these lone actors, both Mr. Godfrey and Mr. Cohen, before I get to the real meat of my question. I think you may be on mute.
While the numbers may not be large in comparison, we have seen over a multi-year period and a significant number of mass casualty attacks conducted by individuals who were inspired to commit that act of violence through narratives and extremist narratives that they viewed online. So while so I would have to say that the level of activity by those that fit that description is significant enough that it's considered one of the primary national security threats facing the country.
So my question revolves around the use, the wedge, the people that are these state actors. How big of a threat is it that folks like China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, other state actors are using these people, these individuals who are disenfranchised, and amplifying their message, driving home a message in order to, to try to increase their passions to carry out violent attacks? How big of a threat is this?
It's highly significant because what you described is one element of a broader effort by foreign hostile powers to undermine credibility of the U.S. government by sowing discord amongst our populace for the purposes of destabilizing our country, undermining our relationships with our key allies through the use of disinformation and other narratives that are intended to exacerbate the problems within the United States. So it's part of a broader effort. And, I will tell you, after the recent trial and conviction of Derek Chauvin, I was surprised to see reporting that there were narratives being spread by groups loosely affiliated with Al-Qaeda, by foreign hostile powers, and by domestic extremist thought leaders in the US that were mirroring each other. And so there is a level of interplay, not necessarily coordination, but these hostile threat actors understand what will drive our society apart, and they're developing narratives for the purposes of doing that.
Mr. Cohen, thank you. Mr. Godfrey, can you talk to us about the partnerships that we have around the world and what we can do better in order to get at the heart of these either state or non-state actors who would drive that wedge and sow discord in our own country?
Thank you very much, Congressman. Happy to address that question. I think that it's a combination of bilateral and multilateral engagement that really is the primary avenue through which we would seek to address the sort of dynamic that Mr. Cohen just identified. Bilaterally, we work with a number of partners on things like information sharing to ensure that we're sharing a common picture of the threat. That's particularly important with partners and allies who, frankly, may be questioning the credibility of the United States as a partner and ally in light of the disconcerting and persistent and aggressive kinds of disinformation campaigns that Assistant Secretary Cohen referred to. But it's also a very practical avenue through which we pass information that can help inform efforts to counter these sorts of narratives, but also the actions of individuals who are seeking to carry out attacks and other sorts of things of that nature. Multilaterally, I think this is a really important line of effort for us as well. It's helping create a common quorum of concern around this issue set that is really one of the big goals of that sort of engagement. There's been quite a lot of development recently on this front. As you can imagine, a number of our European partners and others, including Canada, New Zealand, Australia, are very focused on this threat, in part because some of them have experienced REMV attacks themselves in recent years. So just in the last week, we had the launch of two new initiatives, one under the auspices of the Global Counterterrorism Forum. That's a constellation of 30 like-minded countries that focus on elaborating best practices for addressing terrorist threats. And we are moving out quite rapidly on a set of guidelines that would provide some best practices for national governments to look at when they're elaborating their own protocols for addressing this. We've also got a line of effort under the OSCE that's ongoing, or just launching rather, that I think reflects the level of concern, particularly in Europe. And then finally, I would just note a somewhat more obscure, but frankly really important multilateral platform that we are working with, and that's the International Institute for Justice, which is in Valletta, Malta. And it is focused on developing programs and protocols to train partners from around the world. These are investigators, prosecutors, and judges who focus in the judicial realm on terrorism-related cases. And we've recently launched a REMV-specific line of effort to help equip those practitioners with an understanding of and tools that they will need in looking at REMV terrorist actors when they enter courtrooms.
And Madam Chair, may I have 30 seconds to respond?
Very quickly, because I gave you the 30 that I took. Go ahead.
Thank y'all for the efforts multilaterally to make sure that we protect our way of life. And it's not just ours as a beacon of freedom. These are other countries who have followed the United States lead on this. And I would like to follow up, whether it's a classified briefing or not, to look at the actual numbers of how many people in our society are being affected by this and are being amplified by this, so that we can have a fact-based discussion and make a decision on whether or not it is the fringes of society. With that, I yield back. Thanks for the extra time.
Thanks. I think it will be interesting in that further study to demonstrate that while lone wolf attacks are by far the example of REMV attacks in the United States, so too are things like Al-Qaeda attacks and ISIS-affiliated attacks. And I would want to confirm this, but I believe between the attacks on synagogues and other places we've had in the couple years, dozens more Americans have been killed by REMV attacks than Al-Qaeda associated attacks. But Mr. Cohen, you'll correct me at another time if I'm wrong on that. I now yield to Representative Langevin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. Mr. Godfrey, the mission of the State Department's Global Engagement Center is to counter foreign state and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts. Given their efforts to understand how narratives and counter narratives work in societies, and to work with the tech sector to develop tools and methods to fight false narratives, what is the role of the GEC, the Global Engagement Center, in State Department efforts against racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist groups?
Thank you, Congressman. You're right that the Global Engagement Center has, exactly as you said, the mandate to both track and also counter state and non-state disinformation efforts. That's something that initially came out of, as you know, the focus on Islamist terrorists, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and the like. But certainly it encompasses, as all of our counterterrorism tools here at the Department of State do, all brands or types of terrorism. So those tools are ideologically neutral and they get applied in that way. I think one of the things that is vitally important that both the GEC and the Bureau of Counterterrorism do, often in tandem, is to engage the tech sector directly on the nature of these threats. And we do that for a couple of purposes. One is to ensure, particularly for smaller platform providers that may lack the resources of some of the larger tech companies that have big government services offices, to ensure awareness of what the threat is, what it looks like, and the specific ways in which some of these actors are exploiting platforms for malign purposes. And the second part, as I alluded to earlier in my statement, is to encourage those companies to elaborate and then rigorously enforce terms of service. So to make them responsible, frankly, or to assume voluntarily the responsibility for ensuring that their platforms aren't exploited by these actors.
Thank you. And Mr. Cohen, you've mentioned that the Department of Homeland Security has increased collaboration with partner organizations to more comprehensively understand the collaboration between violent extremists in the U.S. and their counterparts abroad. So what are the operational implications of determining that a domestic violent extremist group or individual has interacted with a foreign RMVE group? Does this change depending on whether or not the following group has a terrorist designation?
Absolutely, Congressman. Thank you for that question. One area where it could impact departmental operation is the more knowledge that we acquire from the intelligence community through our communications with foreign law enforcement and border control authorities, more information that we learn about the travel patterns of extremists abroad, operating abroad, the more we can learn about where their training facilities are located, we can apply that information to the travel pattern analysis and screening and vetting protocols that we've used for years to protect against foreign terrorists from entering the U.S. So that's one area. Secondarily, if there are groups that are designated as terrorist organizations abroad, and we can identify individuals in this country who are engaged in activities to support those groups or collaborate with those groups, that broadens the types of investigative and watch listing authority steps that we can take.
What kind of information sharing activities occur, though, between U.S. agencies and their international partners in these situations?
Well, there's an increasing conversation, and to Chairwoman Slotkin's earlier question about Canadian authorities, we share some limited watch listing information regarding foreign terrorists or people under investigation for terrorism-related charges with Canadian authorities. We receive information from Canadian authorities about individuals who may be associated with extremist organizations abroad who enter Canada and may be entering Canada for the purposes of trying to enter the United States. There have been examples where individuals who entered Canada who were where there was information that they were associated with violent extremist organizations, they sought to enter the U.S. and they were restricted from entering the U.S. Because of that information sharing.
Okay, very good. And my time's expired. Thank you for your answers, and I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize Mr. Meyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, and to our distinguished guests who are here today. I know I've had a chance to speak with Mr. Cohen and just appreciate these continuing and kind of following discussions. I want to try to bridge a little bit of a gap between some of the incidents we've seen in the U.S., which definitely have had, just as the Tree of Life synagogue attack, which have had a REMV motivation, but aren't connected to kind of broader groups, and then the discussion of the broader potentially FTO designations or specially designated or special designations we're looking at through State Department channels. Is the broader concern that the pool of dissatisfaction, the discontents, the socially alienated within the U.S., that is sort of a swamp, a fertile breeding ground for the international entities to try to take advantage of in order to establish more of a beachhead? Or is the concern more that those international groups could be resources for individuals who are motivated within the U.S. but aren't yet part of a group? I guess can you kind of break out how are you viewing that linkage and that ultimate threat?
So it's a little bit of both. Over the past several years, we have seen a number of attacks in the United States that were conducted by individuals, and we can draw a direct correlation between their attack and extremist narratives that were promoted by individuals abroad. Coordinator Godfrey referenced the Christchurch attack. We know that attacker, in addition to live streaming his attack, also posted a document relating to his belief systems online. We know that document was viewed by individuals in the United States who subsequently used the narrative in that to justify their conducting attacks within the United States. So that's one area we're very concerned about: the sharing of ideas, the dissemination of extremist rhetoric and materials, the posting of live streaming videos of acts of violence. That all is, we have found acts of violence in this country that were informed by the attacker consuming that material online. But as you also pointed out, there are increasing concerns within the Department of Homeland Security that we are seeing groups of individuals who hold extremist beliefs, not only just communicating with like-minded people abroad, but traveling to meet with people abroad, perhaps working together to acquire resources through crowdsourcing or fundraising, may engage in the sharing of strategies. We were tracking some online narratives during a recent period where we were seeing postings by individuals abroad who were seeking to travel to the United States to join planned gatherings and protests by extremist organizations. So it's a little bit of both. We're concerned about how that can feed the threat environment domestically, the rhetoric that's being posted online intentionally. And then secondarily, we're concerned about individuals in this country or groups in this country collaborating operationally with individuals abroad.
Yeah, and obviously the strategy for mitigating, the individual versus the strategy for combating a group is going to be very different. And I know when we spoke, it was also, and this is a conversation I've had with our local law enforcement as well. In Michigan, our law enforcement was clued into the attempted kidnapping plot against the governor through one of the participants who grew uneasy at the prospect of some of the targeting of law enforcement that was occurring, and so then became a confidential informant and helped expose that plot and ensure that it was prevented from occurring. So how, I guess we're kind of drilling from that international, almost terrorist mastermind, organized notion, to all the way down to that individual preemption, and how do we identify somebody who may be susceptible, and as we've seen, and I think we've talked about this within some of our Islamic communities as well, that idea of trying to have some intervention before somebody tilts to the point where they may be susceptible to the rhetoric, but how do we get someone off that edge before they go full bore down a violent path? Can you also speak to that more local level engagement interaction?
And
Yeah,
very briefly, please.
Absolutely, Congressman. A big part of our strategy focuses on how we complement the work of a JTTF, for example, to build community-based violence prevention programs. There are times when someone may come to the attention of law enforcement, they don't meet the threshold required for a counterterrorism investigation, but the concern is that person poses a high risk of violence. We are working with local communities around the country to develop programs and approaches that focus on reducing the risk posed by those individuals who are exhibiting those warning signs.
Madam Chair, yield back.
Thank you. And I would just note to Representative Meyer, certainly part of my interest in looking at these RIMB groups abroad is that should they be designated as foreign terrorist organizations, it opens up a potential charge of material support to terrorism here in the United States for those individuals who are supporting those groups. We have that charge for groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and many, many others. And I just, think we should put the same REMV groups through that same process to see what happens, to see if they make threshold on those. I recognize Ms. Jackson Lee for 5 minutes. I think you're still on mute, ma'am. There we go.
I am unmuted now. Thank you so very much. Let me first, good morning. Thank you for this hearing, to the chairwoman and the ranking member, and to the witnesses that are here this morning. Racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, the RMVE groups, I think that the United States has lagged behind, and I'm grateful for the 2 witnesses. And Madam Chair, I'm grateful for a response of a letter before the deadline. I think we're moving in the right direction, but the government over the years has seemingly lagged in addressing the transnational threat from RMVE actors, especially when it comes to designating RMVE organizations and individuals with international ties as foreign terrorist organizations, or especially designated global terrorists. I would venture to say 3 years ago, most Americans were not aware of the Oath Takers, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys. Those of us on Homeland Security obviously were engaging with those names, but when you would speak in public, most people would have a very glazed look. but they have been here and they're circulating. Last evening, the president, rightly so, got a group of bipartisan members inside the chamber to give a standing ovation to law enforcement, to the police officers, to individuals who put their life on the line for us. On January 6th, we saw the extended organizations, I think there are other layers of such, literally take the American flag and beat the symbol of law enforcement at the citadel of democracy near to their death. We obviously lost officers in the midst of this battle. So I want to raise these questions about thought and about the idea that as the investigation proceeds, there's question of the elements of law enforcement that might have been engaged, the elements of the military that might be engaged. And I'd be interested in your assessment of the size of that, how we should respond to that, whether there's an international connection to that. I would also indicate that the second part of my question is, we're beginning to heal the nation with legislation. I know you've heard the name of it, Justice Policing Act, which many of our members have supported, and legislation to repair the history of slavery in this country, H.R. 40. And I wonder if the work of Congress, because we are opinion setters, we are looked to as leaders, contribute to the formulation or the extensiveness of the growth. And when I say Congress, what I'm saying is the body politic. Are these groups responding directly to their sense of the political arena, and they're not in the arena, they're on the outside of the arena, and how that continues to grow them? And so I'd like to start with Mr. Cohen and then Mr. Godfrey. Mr. Cohen?
So Congresswoman, it's nice to see you again. Thank you for the question. On your first question about your concerns about military and law enforcement personnel, as you know, Congressman, I was a police officer for a number of years in California. I worked closely under Mayor Lee Brown in Houston to work on issues relating to policing. It is a career that I'm very proud, a profession I'm very proud to have been a part of. I share your concern. Police officers, members of the military, are susceptible to being influenced by online conspiracy theories and narratives like anybody else. And it's important, and I know I've spoken with a number of police chiefs, and one of the issues that we are focused on within the department and the federal government broadly is to ensure that we have an understanding of whether those narratives are influencing not only the beliefs, but the behavior of the men and women who either serve in the military or in law enforcement. In conversations I've had with our civil liberties and civil rights officer at the department, we're not just there to enforce the law, we're there to enforce the Constitution as well, protect the Constitution. And as law enforcement and security officials, we have a responsibility to ensure that we can do that credibly. To your other question, I have to say it was very poignant. As you know, I was one of the individuals in the Obama administration that helped design the Countering Violent Extremism program. And I have to tell you, as I look back at it, there were some flaws in our assumptions. I think we underestimated the amount of distrust that existed between some communities of color, immigrant communities, and in particular the Arab American and Muslim communities in the United States. And we underestimated how that distrust was going to impact our ability to address this problem. So a big part of our effort today is working to regain that trust. And we're doing that at a time where, quite frankly, it's challenging. The debate on criminal justice reform that's going on across the country, which is a needed debate and a needed discussion, comes at a time where we're dealing with an angry and polarized public. And it comes at a time where we're dealing with significant instances of mass casualty attacks by people who are being influenced by narratives. And we are dealing at a time where our foreign adversaries in particular are using the protests and the debate over racial justice to fracture our society.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you. The chair recognizes Congressman Guest.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to thank each of y'all for spending some time with us today to talk about this very important issue. Mr. Godfrey, I want to talk to you very briefly. you talk in your report, and I think that this has been made clear throughout this hearing, that this is not just an issue that the United States is dealing with, that this is actually an international issue. You talk about attacks that have occurred in Canada, France, Germany, New Zealand. You referenced in your report a recent arrest in Singapore. You talk about the fact that these actors are part of a globally and interconnected online community, and that they use that as a way in which to fundraise, to organize, to plot attacks. If you will, you talk a little bit about the organizational structure, and I would just ask if you might expand on that. Talk about the organizational structures for the REMVs and how they contrast with other terrorist organizations such as ISIS and Al Qaeda.
I would say that there are. I'm so sorry. Are you hearing distortion on that end?
No, sir. I hear you. Hear you clearly.
Okay, super. I'm so sorry. I've just got some feedback here, but I'll drive on. So there are some, I think, ways in which REMV actors or groups compare to organizationally to other terrorist threats that we've been dealing with, including groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda. And you, Congressman, very artfully mentioned a number of those. That is principally using online fora to radicalize, recruit, fundraise, and to some extent organize. I think one of the principal differences is that the REMV groups tend to be much less hierarchical, both in terms of having an identified leader, but also individuals who then are responsible for organizing and conducting operations. There is a lot of focus in REMV groups on rhetoric, and here I would circle back to one of the previous questions and say that a lot of what we see in terms of the interplay between these groups is inspirational versus organizational. I don't want to underestimate the degree to which some of these actors are looking to collaborate on things like how to organize training camps or even move people and material illicitly. But a lot of what we see is really focused on the rhetoric, and this mutually self-reinforcing echo chamber is one way to look at it. And to that end, I think, or to that point, and to the question from Congresswoman Jackson Lee, I think that has tended to amplify and reinforce some of that sense of alienation and grievance that these groups are able to adroitly capitalize on.
And let me I just kind of build on that. You also talk, and I think actually in the same part of your report, about the funding of these groups. And you say some are self-funded, some raise funds from various both legal and illegal sources. Can you talk a little more and expand on that just a little bit about what you're seeing as the different funding sources for the groups that we're talking about today?
Absolutely, Congressman. Thank you. I think REMV actors do raise money from a variety of sources, including merchandise and music sales, donations from individuals, criminal activity such as narcotics and weapons trafficking, selling counterfeit goods turns out to be something that they do quite a lot of as well. And then finally, providing military-style training to other extremists. All of those constitute revenue streams for some of these groups. And as with any sort of range of actors, they're not homogenous. There's some variation as to who kind of focuses more on what within that realm. I think one other important thing that I would emphasize is that by contrast with groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS, which often rely on informal financial institutions and networks, REMV groups often use financial institutions, formal ones, such as banks and monetary transmitters, to move funds both domestically and internationally. And several of these groups, these REMV groups, are also known to use crowdfunding platforms and virtual currency to both solicit donations, but also to effect transfers of funds.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I believe my time is up, and at this time I will yield back.
Okay, we could have given you a few extra seconds there, but got it. And we will probably move to a second round here in a second. But in the meantime, I recognize Mr. Malinowski from New Jersey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to the witnesses. I think this is an incredibly interesting discussion and an important issue. I very strongly agree with you. It's vital to call things by their name. I think it's really interesting, by the way, to highlight that these people, these fringe extremists in our country who see themselves as nationalists are actually internationalists, who see themselves as kind of extreme America First patriots, are actually in many cases receiving funding and support from abroad. And that's important to expose. I think the word terrorism is an appropriate one to use in this context. It is a very powerful word in our effort to discredit these people and what they do and the threat that they pose. But where things get much more complicated, of course, is whether the legal designation of terrorist or terrorist group is appropriate. It would certainly be useful. It's an incredibly powerful thing to designate an organization as an FTO. It enables, it gives us extraordinary powers to deal not just with acts of terrorism after they've been committed, but as Chairwoman Slotkin mentioned, to criminalize material support, really to criminalize membership or association with the group. But of course, with great power comes great responsibility, and we know that governments have sometimes abused the extraordinary powers that these kinds of designations give them. So as we examine that, and we do need to examine the question of whether some of these internationally active groups should be designated, I wanted to ask the witnesses about other potential tools in the toolkit. So for example, we have wide-ranging financial sanctions authorities that we use in the counterterrorism context, the human rights context, in all kinds of national security related situations. Take a group like, say, the Azov brigades in Ukraine, or the Nordic resistance movement, just to name two groups that are of great concern to us. It may be difficult, even if we wanted to do it, to officially label them as foreign terrorist organizations, because you have to show that they have committed acts of terrorism. Should we consider, and if so, do we have the authority under current law to use financial sanctions authorities, SDN listings, against a group that, say, advocates violence openly, that advocates race war, that conducts military-style training of people who come to them to learn, explosives and small arms tactics, none of which may be enough to get them an FTO designation, but which are very dangerous things. Is that something that could be considered? And again, do we have the legal authorities? For either of you.
Okay. Congressman, thank you for the thoughtful question. I'm happy to take an initial stab at it, and I expect Assistant Secretary Cohen may have thoughts as well. I think you've hit on a really important distinction, and that is that between foreign terrorist organization designations and those of specially designated global terrorists. Those are different authorities. We have had a really important development with respect to the latter, the so-called SDGT authorities, in late 2019, when those authorities were broadened under EO 13224 to allow us to designate individuals who were either determined to be leaders of organizations or who directed and conducted training for individuals that were parts of those organizations. And that, in fact, those two prongs were the way that we were able to do the designation of the Russian imperial movement in April of 2020. We are very proactively looking at using those authorities against other REMV actors. We are close in a couple of cases. I don't want to go into too much in this forum about the details, but those challenges I highlighted generically at the top with respect to using the designations authorities are relevant here, and that is that we often have part of the picture of a group and its structure and the activities of some of its individuals, but making sure that we have the picture that meets the legal sufficiency standards can be quite difficult, given the need to have, in some cases, very specific information.
Okay, I know that Mr. Malinowski's time is up, and we'll enter a second round of questions here, and I'll keep people to time so that we can get through the second round, and maybe we can follow up. I'll recognize myself, Mr. Cohen, just to finish up the question I had at the beginning about Canada. So I understand that Canada, if an individual, right, as someone who represents many people who subscribe and consider themselves Proud Boys, for instance, that's a popular thing, a popular group in Michigan. If they were to travel across the bridge or tunnel to go to Windsor, Canada, I hear you that it would be the Canadian customs officials who would look their name up, see if they're in any watch lists that we share with them, and then make a distinction. I guess my question is, in terms of the inputting of data into those watch lists, has anything changed since Canada designated the Proud Boys and the base terrorist organizations from the American inputting of that data?
So as it currently stands, inputting data into the terrorist watch list would be done by the FBI. It would have to have reached a threshold of reasonable suspicion, would be based on an investigation, and under some circumstances, not on a regular basis, but on some circumstances, that information could be made available to Canadian authorities proactively. So for example, if I'm conducting an investigation into an individual and I become aware that that individual who is being investigated for violent activity is traveling to Canada, Canada may be provided prior notification so investigative activities could take place. But from a U.S. government perspective, we're not trolling through the internet trying to find people who say that they're associated with Proud Boys or are posting pictures of themselves wearing Proud Boys garb and providing that information to the Canadians. We don't do that anyway. And currently, I am told that it would be under that information that's purely related to a domestic terrorism situation with no nexus to a foreign government is not regularly shared.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And Mr. Godfrey, in this attempt to get more intelligence and information and data on these RIMVs abroad, can you tell me what the State Department has already done to try and increase what we know about these groups? I mean, we know embassies across the world were not thinking about Al-Qaeda before 9/11. They weren't thinking about ISIS before they took over Iraq and Syria. And only with, guidance did they start to really collect and ask about those things. Can you tell me what the State Department has or has not done on this issue?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. On March 19th, we sent a cable to all of our diplomatic and consular posts asking them to engage with their host governments regarding individuals or groups affiliated with REMV, and particularly those with white identity terrorism ties, and to share that information back in formal reporting about REMV networks and activities in their countries. To date, we've received responses from 64 posts globally and are expecting additional responses in the weeks ahead. Some of those have been a little bit slowed by the combination of COVID and Ramadan, respectively, but we're making some pretty good progress. I don't want to get into specifics about what individual posts said because we do need to protect the correspondence with our partner governments, but I do want to talk about a couple of trends that were highlighted. I can say that in Europe, there was the greatest concern that was expressed about the REMV threat, including particularly transnational linkages. And a number of European governments noted that they were seeing REMV as a growing counterterrorism priority. They assessed that REMV lone actors posed a greater threat than REMV organizations that were publicly known to them. They also noted that in a number of countries in Europe, REMV actors have been specifically encouraged to join the military or law enforcement to gain tactical experience that could subsequently be used in targeting their perceived enemies. In terms of funding, there was a common thread of donations and solicitations online, as well as the sales of apparel, music, and literature. And then I would also note that some of the governments that we've talked with are encountering many of the same challenges that we've talked about here today in terms of countering the threat, and that lack of hierarchical structure and a central command and the use of secure communication techniques and platforms has really complicated efforts to get after the threat. And then finally, a number of posts noted that their host government interlocutors had emphasized that REMV actors have increasingly been moving to smaller, newer, lesser known, and more fully encrypted platforms for communication in an effort to escape government scrutiny.
Great. Thank you for that. Very helpful. Chair recognizes Representative Pfluger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to have several questions for both witnesses or either witness. Which country, non-state actor, state actor presents the biggest threat right now to sowing discord and using these actors in the United States to amplify this threat?
Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, from the Department of Homeland Security perspective, we've been concerned and have monitored intelligence community reporting on efforts by Russia and Iran in particular.
Mr. Godfrey? You're on mute.
Apologies. We would share that assessment, Congressman.
Okay, very good. That's very helpful, and I think we want to continue to dig into that. My second question is, when it comes to the designations, and I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I appreciate Mr. Malinowski's comments on it. What are the unintended consequences that you believe when it comes to our First Amendment rights, the protected rights, that if we do move towards designating and explore this could happen? I mean, where are the dangers in this?
Congressman, could I ask, when you mention designations, are we talking about foreign entities or domestic entities or both, perhaps?
Well, for anyone in the United States who is working with transnational groups, so let's say that Iran and Russia are able to get to them, and then they have the organizations through other, European countries, for instance. If we move towards designating, what First Amendment rights are we likely to either breach or have as an unintended consequence that makes it, very difficult and blurring of the lines?
So just speaking for the State Department, and I'll defer to Assistant Secretary Cohen perhaps on the domestic piece, I think we would only envision a situation in which we could use our authorities to designate actors abroad. There would have to be a change in the scope of our authorities to enable us to contemplate designating individuals here at home. And I don't know if Assistant Secretary Cohen might have something further he wants to add.
No, I would just add simply that, Congressman, you're hitting on one of the central challenges in dealing with this threat, which is being able to distinguish between protected speech, constitutionally protected speech, and actions that relate to a specific threat and threat of violence in particular. So for us, for the department or for law enforcement to take action against an individual, we have to have information that says that reflects behavior beyond simply posting racist or extremist narratives online. We would have to see activity that relates that belief system to the potential threat of violence.
When it comes to, and thank you both for that, I mean, it is a very difficult and complex issue here. When it comes to the work, the coordination, the information sharing, intelligence sharing, and how our JTTF is working, what authorities do we not have right now that would help us identify and detect and maybe even intervene at times?
So that's a very interesting question, Congressman, and it goes to the question that Congressman Mara brought up. A number of the circumstances that we've experienced over the year have been over the past several years have been effectively disrupted by the investigations of a JTTF. But we've also seen situations in which an individual has come to the attention of law enforcement authorities. They didn't meet the definitional thresholds that would warrant a terrorism or counterterrorism investigation, but they were still deemed to be significant risk, and in some cases have even gone out and committed an act of violence. So in conjunction to the activities of the JTTF, which again have been highly effective and are an important part of dealing with this threat, we have to look at other activities that can take place within the community, whether it is the conduct of a threat assessment investigation that assesses the risk posed by an individual and the employment of different types of threat management strategies, whether it be mental health support, whether it be working with the family of an individual who's exhibiting these behaviors, whether it's some other type of law enforcement action or the imposition of a red flag law that restricts their access to a firearm. There's a number of things that can be done at the local level by local authorities and community members that can reduce the risk posed by an individual who's exhibiting the warning sign. So that's a big area of emphasis for us at the department. Is we adjusted our grant program language and just so that we can support those types of activities at the local level.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Thank you, Mr. Godfrey.
And I heard the clicker, Madam Chairwoman. So.
Thank you. I'm trying. It's, you know, it's the virtual world. The chair recognizes Representative Gottheimer.
Thank you, Chairwoman Slotkin, for holding this very important and timely hearing. As FBI Director Wray recently testified before Congress, the top threat we face from domestic violent extremists continues to be those we identify as racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically those who advocate for the superiority of the white race and who were the primary source of ideologically motivated lethal incidents of violence in 2018 and 2019. Assistant Secretary Cohen, can you please discuss how US-based white supremacists and other domestic extremists have increasingly adopted the tactic of foreign terrorist organizations and how DHS is working to address the threat?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. So the department, Secretary Mayorkas instructed my office to conduct an operational review of the department, which is ongoing, and it seeks to answer a very specific question, which is based on the current state of the threat, are we doing all that we can to address the threat posed by domestic violent extremists? And areas that we are focusing on is what more can we do to address the use of online platforms by foreign and domestic threat actors who seek to incite violence? What more can we do to increase literacy amongst our young people and individuals who may be potentially influenced by those online narratives? What more can we do from a perspective of training? Should we be increasing our presence on joint terrorism task forces? How do we better leverage the watch listing authorities and travel pattern analysis capabilities of CBP and TSA in order to identify violent extremists who may be preparing to travel domestically and internationally? Those are some of the issues that we're working on, but I look forward to briefing the committee more fully at the completion of the review.
Thank you. I don't know, Cohen, if you're able to answer this given the ongoing review, but I've been very focused on the social media aspect of foreign and domestic extremists for radicalization and recruitment. Are there ways that you can talk about of how we can more effectively identify and prevent the online spread of despicable ideologies that we know encourage people to engage in lethal violence?
That's a great question, and I share your concerns. I think this is one of the driving forces behind the current threat. One of the things that we are looking at intently at the department is what more can we do to identify emerging narratives as early as possible and assess whether those narratives are likely to influence acts of violence and how fast they're spreading across multiple platforms. Once we are able to do that, we will be able to anticipate potential target areas, and we can work with our partners at the federal level and at the state and local level to reduce the risk to those targets. A good example of that is what we experienced in Washington, D.C. between January 6th and January 20th, where after the January 6th incident, we continued to see reflections online that people intended to come back on the 20th to engage in violence. So we were able to take steps to mitigate the risk through more visible security and other measures. So that's the type of work that we're looking at. We're working closely with the tech industry and non-government entities to learn from them, to see how they are identifying toxicity and resonance of narratives online.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As you know, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designation was first used in 1997. Today, nearly 25 years later, the terrorism landscape looks very different. We increasingly see white supremacist extremists spreading their ideologies and distributing guidance and encouragement for independent actors outside of established groups or channels. Acting Coordinator Godfrey, is our current designation and sanctions regime sufficient, in your opinion, for combating diffuse, leaderless, or amorphous, racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, threats, and how do we better target these types of actors?
Thank you, Congressman. I think that, as I have mentioned a couple of times, The authorities that we currently have, which are very much focused on international actors, have demonstrated themselves down through the years to be quite effective. I'm not sure it's so much a question of the authorities themselves as the information that underpins getting to a legal sufficiency standard that's required to take those designation actions. That's the real challenge for us with respect to these groups, which, as you said, are different from some of the kinds of terrorist groups that we've dealt with down through the years.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes Mr. Meyer from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciated the discussion, and Madam Chair, we've also kind of discussed on other channels kind of how we strike that right balance between protecting civil liberties and making sure that we are adequately preparing our law enforcement for the task. And indeed, I think that is the overall intent of this subcommittee hearing today, as we're looking at what those higher level distinctions would be. I guess one request, and then I'll go into some more remarks, is I know there was a reference to in one of the documents to a classified annex or kind of more fulsome report on this issue. Would love to speak or have an opportunity for the committee as a whole to dive a little bit more deeply, because I know especially as we're on the Homeland Security Committee, but we're tying into international entities as well. So would love to get the fuller picture. And I'm well aware, Madam Chair, as well, that you had reached out to the DNI's office to try to get some more information and have them participate. But as we're looking down and assessing between some of the neo-Nazi elements like Atomwaffen versus those who don't fall into his needed description, understanding that overall threat profile on a specific level would be appreciative. And now, I guess, getting back to some of our panelists here today, we have that distinction, or that I guess I would love to dig a little bit more deeper into the balance between what we've seen from propaganda or misinformation that's been amplified by foreign governments, especially malign foreign governments with an intent towards the recruitment or the populating of that misinformation ecosphere for domestic consumption, versus where have foreign governments, I guess here's the question, have we seen foreign governments that have been actively using organizations that could potentially be designated FTOs? Have we seen foreign governments actively using them in order to recruit or bolster membership domestically? I guess most likely for Mr. Cohen.
Congressman, thank you for the question. That's probably an issue we would have to discuss in a closed session to address it completely.
I guess just stepping a little bit back, have we seen foreign governmental influence been more on supporting organizations that may seek to recruit, or on amplifying information that gets consumed in a non-organizational setting on an individual basis?
So without touching the first part of your question, what we have seen are examples where foreign hostile power will watch what's going on in this country, and then they will use events and some topics that they have focused on in the past have been issues relating to immigration, issues relating to discussions on race, and issues discussed regarding terrorism, enforcement of terrorism, addressing terrorism threats. They've used issues like that to try to sow discord amongst our populace. They know these are issues that are passionately being debated, and they will use narratives on both sides of the issue for the purposes of inflaming the discussion. As I mentioned earlier, it was really intriguing to me to see common, after the conviction was announced of Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. It was really interesting to see that we saw common language being used, for example, focusing on whether the jury had been unfairly influenced to make to come up with the verdict they came up with. We saw that on forums associated with Russia, forums associated with Iran, as well as domestic extremists. We saw.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I'm just running a little bit low on time. I want to get one last question in real quick. I know we've talked about how an FTO designation may bolster domestic law enforcement. Would an FTO designation also bolster our ability to combat that international or that foreign state nexus or that foreign state support for a REMV internationally?
That it would depend on the individual group and the nature of the proxy relationship between a foreign state actor and that group as to the extent to which an FTO designation could have an impact. Without going into too much in this forum, I would say that there are some instances in which that could in fact have an impact.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. You're back.
No problem. And I think absolutely we can certainly have a discussion about a classified session going into some of these details. I would also suggest that any member who's interested ask the Homeland staff to pull the classified kind of production that's gone on in the past couple of months on these groups or on whatever issue you're interested in. They will pull that. You can sit in a room and read it. I do it pretty frequently. And while the collection is not great, right? I don't want anyone to think that there's incredibly detailed information. It is certainly an interesting read file to pull. So the chair recognizes Representative Jackson Lee from Texas.
Chair, and I cannot see the clock, and so I really lost out in terms of trying to get my questions in. I appreciate Mr. Cohen gave a very thorough answer, but forgive me, I just cannot see the clock. And it makes it very difficult to get your questions in. So I will do my very best. This is a very important topic. I have in my opening statement about 4 pages of terroristic acts, beginning with April 15th, 2013, the Boston attacks during the Boston Marathon. Individuals here in the United States, one could argue that there was an international issue, but domestic terrorism. To the 2 individuals in Dallas in 2016, ex-military who shot and killed 5 police officers, and an offender in Louisiana that killed 6 police officers in Baton Rouge. I say that because my last questioning finished on police officer involvement. These individuals were allegedly with Sovereign Nation. We haven't mentioned them, and I'd like to get a comment about that, Mr. Cohen. If I could get it very briefly, I want to make sure that I didn't end on the note that all of the military and all police officers are involved with the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys and the Oath Takers. I wanted to suggest that there was a minute group that we needed to assess. And I wanted to kind of get an understanding of how Homeland Security was doing that. I'd be interested if you want to comment on the Sovereign Nation. If you could do that very briefly so that I can raise questions with Mr. Godfrey as well. Mr. Cohen?
Yes, Congressman. Sovereign citizens believe that the current government of the United States is illegal and they have no responsibility to obey the laws or defer to authority figures such as local police. And there have been a number of instances where they've engaged in lethal encounters, killing police officers. I agree with you that the overwhelming majority of law enforcement officials around this country go out every day to protect the nation. There are a small group that may be susceptible to being influenced, and we have a responsibility to make sure that we counteract that.
Right. So what I want to make the point is you're not excluding or precluding your work to ensure that in those ranks you don't have. I know the military is being assessed by the Secretary of Defense, but I just want to make sure that you are looking at those groups as well, so we weed them out from the larger body. Is that correct?
Yes, we've just initiated a major effort across the department to do that.
Very good. Thank you. Let me ask, and I think this question was asked, but I just want to make sure, Mr. Godfrey, in terms of the numbers of those domestic terrorists going internationally to join wars, we were familiar with the Ukraine war, that some of our terrorists from here were going to refine their skills. How extensive is that?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. It's nice to see you again. I think the last time we crossed paths was in Riyadh. To your question, the number, and this will echo what Assistant Secretary Cohen mentioned earlier, the numbers are not terribly large. The concern we have is that the impact of those individuals traveling and acquiring skills in war zones is disproportionate, such that when they return, they have skill. They typically come back more radicalized than when they left, would be one point to make. And the other would be that they do have hard skills that they are able to, in some cases, use in attacking targets domestically. One final note, one of the things we're hearing increasingly in diplomatic channels that I think would be interesting for the members of the committee to know is increased concern from partners abroad about the U.S. Racially and ethnically motivated